In the 14th century, Pope Clement V sent several Franciscan friars to Khanbaliq, modern-day Beijing, to consecrate the archbishop of a new archdiocese that included most of China and India. Why did the Latin Church place an archdiocese so far from Europe? Find out on this episode of Footnoting History. What's up, Footnoters? It's Josh, ready to take you on a journey into East Asia and a whole bunch of the unexpected. I can't promise that this episode will be all that long, mostly because the source material for what we're about to discuss is scant, but we're going to do our best. In 1307, Pope Clement V issued a bull, not the well-horned bovine, but a formal papal decree that established a new archdiocese at Khanbaliq and put a man named John of Montecorvino in charge as archbishop. So that's right, at the beginning of the 14th century, the first pope of the so-called Avignon papacy established an archdiocese in China. And not just China, but what is now Beijing. I'm not sure if you've got geography seared into your brain, but Beijing is pretty far north and fairly far east. Needless to say, it's a long way from Europe, especially Avignon, France. At the time, Beijing was known as Khanbaliq, which I'm sure I'm mispronouncing, and it was ruled by the Yuan dynasty, better known as the Mongols. Yes, those Mongols. I don't know what other Mongols you'd be thinking of, but I want to be clear that it was the Mongols of the Genghis Khan variety. When most people in the West think of the Mongols, I imagine they don't picture a people who were particularly tolerant of Western outsiders coming to preach about religion. Instead, most probably think of the Genghis Khan of Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. Lots of meat eating, grunting, pillaging, and the like. Let's not get too out of control. The Mongol kingdoms were not bastions of free speech and expression, where every person imaginable was granted unending amounts of tolerance. But the Khans, for the most part, allowed for relatively free religious practice. As long as you paid your tribute, of course. No tribute, and that toleration ran out really fast. One of my all-time favorite medieval documents is the letter that Guyuk Khan, who reigned from 1246 to 1248, wrote Pope Innocent IV after Papa Inno wrote to the Khan and admonished him to accept Christ and to submit to the Pope's ecclesiastical authority. Guyuk was like, nah bruh. Guyuk wrote that it was the Pope who needed to submit and pay him homage, or else, quote, if you act against it, how then can we know what will happen? Innie, my dude, you should listen. But this is Innocent IV we're talking about, so wait, nope. That'll have to wait for another day. Okay, so the Mongols weren't a kill first, ask questions later kind of people. That's the point I was trying to make. So what about Europe? How do Europeans get linked up with the Mongols in such a faraway place? I imagine that many footnoters know the answer to this question. If you don't know, think about a certain call and response game that you played in a pool when you were growing up. Yes, you're right, it's Marco Polo. Well, let's be clear about something. Marco Polo was hardly the first European to travel to Asia. We know that European traders traveled the Silk Roads. We even have primary documents from both the Romans and the Chinese that describe each other. In Pliny the Elder's Natural History, for example, he writes about the Series, the Chinese, and silk production. Western Europe certainly knew something about Asia. Just check out a medieval T&O map. Asia figures in prominently, even if they weren't particularly clear on many important details. Our minds immediately go to Marco Polo because he literally wrote the book on traveling to Mongol China, the book of the marvels of the world. But I have to tell you folks that Marco wasn't the first 13th century European to travel and meet with the Mongol Khans. When I think of European travelers to Asia in the 13th century, I immediately go to the Franciscan friar William of Rubruck. William of Rubruck traveled to Karakorum, which was then the capital of the Mongols back in 1254. Marco Polo did not make his journey until 1271. So if it's a race, William of Rubric I. We don't hear much about William of Rubric because his work did not receive wide publication until 1599, when Richard Hakluyt translated it into English and published it. Marco Polo's work was published much earlier, but we still don't have a truly authoritative account. Regardless of who was first, or whose work was more immediately important, the results of the travels of William of Rubric and Marco Polo piqued interest in travel to the Mongol East. I say this because it's in the 14th century that we see an explosion of medieval travel writing, and we're talking about some of the big names here, particularly John Mandeville. Enter the central figure of today's story, John of Montecorvino. As you might expect from his name, John of Montecorvino was Italian. He belonged to the Franciscan order and had earned the trust of Pope Gregory X. So much so that John was appointed a delegate to Michael VIII Palaiologos of Byzantium to negotiate reunion of the Latin and Greek churches. If Michael VIII Palaiologos rings a bell, I'll bet it's because you listened to the 2-part Sicilian Vespers episode I did. If you haven't listened to that episode, what are you doing with your life? When you finish this episode, give that one a listen. After spending time in Persia doing missionary work, John received a commission from the papacy to do the same work in China. This was after the papacy had received a letter from Kublai Khan requesting that missionaries be sent to his court. Apparently, Kublai was quite friendly and sympathetic to Christianity. Miraculously, we have 2 letters from John of Montecorvino that have survived, and fortunately have been translated into English. These 2 letters come from 1305 and 1306 and contain some details of John's activities in Khanbaliq. John of Montecorvino claimed to have recently built a church and attached 3 bells to its bell tower. He also claims to have baptized 6,000 people, though in another letter he claims to have only baptized 5,000. He also claims that he could have baptized 30,000 other people, but the Nestorian Christians in the area accused him of being a pretender and prevented him from doing his work. If you've never heard of Nestorian Christianity before, it's a version of Christianity that follows the Christological views of a bishop from the 5th century named Nestorius. Nesti believed that Jesus had 2 separate and distinct natures, human and divine, whereas mainline Christianity believed that Jesus had 2 natures that existed in hypostatic union, in other words, fully human and fully divine simultaneously. Nestorian Christianity really caught on in the East in places like Persia. I'm not sure if John of Montecorvino correctly identifies the pre-existing Christians in China as Nestorians. I'm quite suspicious that Nestorian was a catch-all term used by Latin Christians for Christians that didn't fit into the usual Latin-Greek binary. Sorry for the theological weeds there. I live for this stuff. Even my poor US history students have to deal with this from time to time. They'll just be minding their own business and then bam, theology. In any event, John of Montecorvino closed his letter by saying that he was old and gray, more from work than age, and he said that he couldn't be any older than 58. He claims to have learned the Mongol language and translated the New Testament and the Psalter. Quite frankly, I do not know how quickly John's letters got back to the Pope in Avignon, but I do know that, in 1307, Pope Clement V issued his bull establishing the Archdiocese of Khanbaliq. Until 1318, this archdiocese oversaw all of Asia. I would imagine it would be difficult to do this in 2025, let alone back in 1307. Clement V sent 7 other Franciscans to serve as John of Montecorvino's bishops, dividing Asia into 7 separate dioceses. Unfortunately for John, though, only 3 of the 7 arrived: Gerard Albuini, Peregrino de Castello, and Andrew of Perugia. John of Montecorvino, after he had been consecrated bishop, established the episcopal see at Zaitan, modern-day Guangzhou, which these 3 other Franciscans became bishops. John of Montecorvino's activities between the years of his consecration and death in 1328 are not well known. He does appear in the writings of several medieval travel writers, however. Odoric of Pordenone, for example, mentions John in his writings, and John appears in the Book of the Estate of the Great Khan, written around 1330 after Pope John the 22nd commissioned it. There's not much more to the story of the Archdiocese of Khanbaliq that we know either. We do know that after John of Montecorvino died, there was a brief interregnum in the archdiocese. In 1333, Pope John the 22nd sent Nicholas of Batras to succeed John as archbishop, but we do not know for sure if Nicholas actually arrived there. Pope Benedict XII mentions Nicholas of Batras in a letter that he wrote to the Khan, and Nicholas's name appears in a few other letters, but other than that, we don't know much. Khan Togan Temur sent an embassy to Pope Benedict XII in 1336, asking that he send more missionaries to his court, and even waxed a bit nostalgic about John of Montecorvino. One of the last things we know about the medieval mission to China is the murder of the Bishop of Zeitun, James of Florence, which occurred in 1362. After 1368 and the rise of the Ming Dynasty in China, all mentions of the Latin mission disappear completely. The Ming did not want anything non-Chinese hanging around. In fact, when Matteo Ricci, a Jesuit missionary, reached China at the end of the 16th century, he was quite convinced that he was the first Catholic to have ever set foot in Beijing. So that's the story of the Archdiocese of Khanbaliq. Believe me, I wish we had more detailed information, but that's how the history of the medieval past so often goes. Catholic Christianity would return to China in the 17th century, and today there are 20 archdioceses there, supported by 94 dioceses. In fact, there is even an Archdiocese of Beijing that sees itself as the successor of Khanbaliq. It was restored in 1690 as a diocese and then raised back to an archdiocese only in 1946. So I suppose it's time we ask what we do with Khanbaliq. Well, let me take another direction with this. Stick with me here. It's awfully tempting to view the archdiocese as a complete failure. The Khans of China did not convert to Christianity and eventually adopted Islam, nor were there a large number of converts. In fact, we don't know how many converts there were, besides John of Montecorvino saying that between 5,000 and 6,000 people converted. But I think that reducing the archdiocese to success and failure misses the point. The little about Khanbaliq we know tells us a lot about what missionary life in China was like. It gives us a sense of the struggle that Latin missionaries had while they competed for attention with the so-called Nestorian Christians. And it gives us a sense of just how daunting the task of becoming a truly international institution was for the Catholic Church. And believe me, Pope John the 22nd tried very hard to institute Latin discipline throughout Asia. In fact, I wrote a whole dissertation about it. So give Khanbaliq some credit. It may be a footnote in the history of medieval mission, but highlighting the footnotes of history, that's kind of what we do here. Thanks for listening to this episode of Footnoting History. A reminder that we are on Facebook, Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky, and Pinterest as @Footnoting History. We have a Patreon too. Sign up for our Patreon for special extras, some behind-the-scenes antics, a quarterly newsletter, and other fun content. And a shout out to Christine, who puts them all together and always does a wonderful job. Don't forget that we're on YouTube with fully captioned episodes. Make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. We'd love to see you there. Take care, and don't forget that the best stories are always in the footnotes.